The Co-Parenting Pact. A Charleston pet romance continued. Chapter 4. Weathering the Storm. 2 weeks later, the handoffs had become exercises in polite torture. Gone were the lingering conversations on Lucas's front porch, the easy banter about Storm's adventures, the way Tempest's eyes lit up when she laughed at something he said. Now their exchanges were efficient, cordial, and completely devastating to Lucas's peace of mind. He had a good week, Tempest said, standing at the bottom of his porch steps like she was maintaining a safe distance. No incidents at the dog park, though he did make friends with a Great Dane named Mabel. That's good, Lucas replied, accepting Storm's leash. Did he eat all his meals? Most of them. He's gotten picky about his breakfast kibble, but he'll eat it if you mix in a little wet food. I'll make a note of that. Okay, then. She was already backing toward her car. I'll see you Friday. Friday, he confirmed. She drove away without looking back, and Lucas stood on his porch watching her taillights disappear into Charleston traffic, wondering how they'd managed to make sharing custody of a dog feel like divorce proceedings. What do you think, Storm? He asked, kneeling down to pet the dog who was watching Tempest's car with the same longing expression Lucas was trying to hide. Did we mess this up? Storm whined softly and pressed closer to Lucas's legs, which felt like agreement. Inside, Lucas tried to distract himself with his usual Sunday routine, reviewing his schedule for the week, meal prepping, organizing Storm's supplies. But every few minutes, he found himself thinking about Tempest, the way she'd looked in his kitchen that morning 2 weeks ago, her hair mussed from sleep and wearing his t-shirt. The way she'd said, "It's what makes sense," without meeting his eyes. The way he'd let her walk away without fighting for what they'd found together. His phone buzzed with a text from Monica. "Dinner at our place tonight? James is grilling. Storm welcome." Lucas stared at the message, knowing Monica well enough to recognize a wellness check disguised as a social invitation. He'd been quieter than usual at work, more focused on his cases and less interested in their usual lunch break conversations about life outside the clinic. "Can't tonight. Maybe next week." Her response came immediately. "Lucas Beauregard, if you don't show up at my house in 2 hours, I'm staging an intervention. I'm fine." "You're miserable. There's a difference. Bring wine and your attitude, in that order." 3 hours later, Lucas found himself sitting on Monica's back deck with a beer and a plate of perfectly grilled salmon, watching Storm play fetch with Monica's 8-year-old daughter Emma while her 5-year-old son Jake provided enthusiastic commentary. "So," Monica said, settling into the chair beside him, "want to tell me why you've been walking around the clinic like someone canceled Christmas?" "I'm fine," Lucas said automatically. "You've said 'I'm fine' 17 times in the past 2 weeks. I counted." "You counted?" "I'm concerned." Counting seemed like the most scientific way to document your emotional decline. Lucas took a long pull of his beer, watching Storm leap enthusiastically for a tennis ball that Emma had thrown just slightly out of reach. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" "Did something happen with the dog custody arrangement? Is Tempest not holding up her end of the deal?" "Tempest is fine. She's great with Storm. But..." Lucas was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for feelings he'd been deliberately not examining. "But I think I'm falling in love with her," he said finally. "And that wasn't part of the plan." Monica's face lit up like he'd just announced he'd won the lottery. "Lucas, that's wonderful." "No, it's not. It's a disaster." "Why?" "Because she doesn't want that. She made it very clear that we should keep things professional, co-parents only." "And you just agreed with her?" "What was I supposed to do? Argue? Tell her she was wrong about her own feelings?" Monica set down her wine glass and turned to face him fully. "Did it occur to you that maybe she was scared? That maybe she was protecting herself the same way you've been protecting yourself for the past 2 years?" Monica, no, listen to me. I watched you after the divorce, remember? You built walls so high that I wasn't sure anyone would ever get through them. And then this woman shows up and somehow she does. And instead of recognizing that as the miracle it is, you're both running away from it. She lost her twin sister 8 months ago, Lucas said quietly. She's grieving. She doesn't need me complicating her life. Or maybe she needs exactly what you need, someone to remind her that life is still worth living. Before Lucas could respond, Storm came bounding over, tennis ball in his mouth and tail wagging. He dropped the ball at Lucas's feet and looked up expectantly. Again? Lucas asked, picking up the slobbery ball. You're not tired yet? Storm barked once, which everyone present interpreted as a definitive no. As Lucas threw the ball back toward the yard, Emma came running over. Dr. Lucas, she said, Storm is the best dog ever. Are you going to marry the lady who shares him with you? Emma, Monica said quickly, that's not really. Because if you marry her, then Storm would be like your real dog instead of your shared dog. And that would be better, right? Out of the mouths of babes, Lucas thought, feeling something twist in his chest. It's complicated, sweetheart, he said. Emma considered this with the seriousness of an 8-year-old who believed all problems had solutions if adults would just think harder. Mom says complicated just means you haven't figured out the right answer yet, she said. Maybe you should ask Storm what he thinks. As if summoned by his name, Storm trotted back over and sat down between Lucas's legs, looking up at him with those soulful brown eyes that seemed to see right through all his careful defenses. What do you think, boy? Lucas asked softly. Should I fight for her? Storm's tail wagged once, definitively. I think that's a yes, Emma said with satisfaction. Later that evening, after Monica had sent him home with leftover salmon and a lecture about not letting fear make his decisions for him, Lucas sat on his back porch with Storm and tried to figure out how to be brave. His phone sat on the table beside him, Tempest's contact information glowing on the screen. He'd started to call her 6 times in the past hour, then lost his nerve each time. What was he supposed to say? That he'd made a mistake, that he wanted to try again, that he was falling in love with her, and he thought, hoped, she might be falling in love with him too. Before he could overthink it any further, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. From Tempest. Hello? He answered, his heart suddenly racing. Lucas. Her voice sounded strange, tight and worried. Is Storm with you? Yes, he's right here. What's wrong? There's a hurricane coming. Category 2, maybe Category 3. It's going to hit Charleston directly. Lucas looked up at the sky, which was clear and star-filled, giving no indication of impending disaster. But he'd learned enough about Tempest's work to trust her meteorological expertise completely. When? He asked. 48 hours, maybe less. The city's going to issue evacuation orders tomorrow morning. Okay. Lucas's mind immediately shifted into crisis mode. Where do you want to meet? We should evacuate together. Keep Storm with one of us. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Tempest spoke again, her voice was even more strained. Lucas, I'm not evacuating. What do you mean you're not evacuating? I mean, I'm staying. This is what I do. I track storms, document them, report on them. This is the biggest system to hit Charleston in 15 years. I can't leave. Tempest, this is insane. You could be killed. I'll be fine. I know what I'm doing. You'll be alone in a Category 3 hurricane. I won't be alone. I'll have Storm. The words hit Lucas like a physical blow. Absolutely not. Excuse me? You are not keeping Storm in a hurricane. I won't allow it. You won't allow it? Her voice was ice cold now. Last I checked, we were co-parents, which means equal decision-making authority. Not when one parent wants to make a decision that could get him killed. I'm not going to get him killed. I'm a professional, Lucas. I've been in dozens of storms, and I know how to stay safe. By yourself, maybe, but not with a dog who's afraid of thunderstorms. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Fine, Tempest said finally. You can take Storm and evacuate. But I'm staying. Then I'm staying too. What? If you won't leave, then I'm not leaving either. Someone needs to be here to patch you up when this brilliant plan of yours goes sideways. Lucas, that's stupid, reckless, exactly as insane as what you're planning. He stood up and began pacing his porch, Storm watching him with concerned eyes. Yeah, it is, but I'm not leaving you alone. You barely know me, Tempest said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. I know enough. Another silence, longer this time. We should probably finalize our storm preparations together, Tempest said eventually. If we're both staying. We should, Lucas agreed. Can you meet me at my place tomorrow morning? Early. I'll be there at 7. Lucas? Yeah, thank you. After she hung up, Lucas remained standing on his porch, looking up at the deceptively calm sky and wondering if he'd just made the best decision of his life or the last decision he'd ever make. Storm whined softly and pressed against his legs, and Lucas reached down to scratch behind his ears. What do you think, boy? Are we crazy? Storm's tail wagged, and Lucas chose to interpret that as encouragement rather than confirmation of his temporary insanity. He had less than 12 hours to storm-proof 2 houses and figure out how to tell the woman he was falling in love with that he wasn't going anywhere, hurricane or no hurricane. The next morning dawned gray and humid, with an ominous stillness that made the hair on Lucas's arms stand up. The city had issued mandatory evacuation orders at 6 a.m., and the highways were already clogged with residents fleeing inland. Lucas drove through increasingly empty streets to reach Tempest's carriage house, Storm panting nervously in the back seat as if he could sense the approaching storm. He found Tempest on her rooftop deck, surrounded by weather monitoring equipment and looking like a woman preparing for battle. She was dressed in practical clothes, jeans, boots, a rain jacket tied around her waist, and her hair was braided back in a way that meant business. "How's it looking?" he called up to her. "Like we're idiots for staying," she called back, but she was smiling when she said it. 20 minutes later, they were in her living room with laptops, weather radios, and enough bottled water to supply a small army. Storm had claimed the couch and was watching their preparations with the resigned expression of a dog who'd learned that when his humans started acting weird, it was best to just go with it. So the eye should pass directly over Charleston around midnight, Tempest explained, pointing to the satellite images on her screen. We'll get the worst winds between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., with storm surge peaking around the same time. And you're sure this place will hold up? It's survived 3 major hurricanes since it was built in 1847. The walls are 2 feet thick, and Jazz upgraded the windows to hurricane glass 5 years ago. As if summoned by his name, there was a knock on the front door, followed by an elderly voice calling, "Tempest, honey, you in there?" Tempest opened the door to reveal Jazz Wise, her landlord and surrogate grandfather, carrying a small overnight bag and leading an ancient beagle on a leash. "Jazz," Tempest said, clearly surprised. "I thought you evacuated with your daughter." "Changed my mind," Jazz said, stepping into the living room and nodding politely at Lucas. "Figured if you 2 young fools are staying, somebody with sense ought to stick around to keep an eye on you." "Jazz, this is Lucas. Lucas, Jazz." The 2 men shook hands, sizing each other up with the careful attention of males establishing territorial boundaries. "So, you're the veterinarian," Jazz said. "The one sharing custody of Storm here." "I am." "Good. Tempest needs someone looking after her, and that dog's got more sense than most people." "I don't need anyone looking after me," Tempest protested, but there was affection in her voice. "Course you don't, honey. That's why you're planning to ride out a Category 3 hurricane in a 200-year-old building." Jazz's beagle, who had been politely greeting Storm, suddenly lifted his head and whined. Both dogs moved toward the windows, hackles raised, staring out at the increasingly dark sky. "Animals know," Jazz said, watching them. "Storm's going to be a bad one." Over the next few hours, they worked together to prepare both Tempest's carriage house and Jazz's main house for the hurricane. They moved furniture away from windows, checked flashlights and batteries, filled bathtubs with water, and secured anything that could become a projectile in hurricane-force winds. By late afternoon, the rain had started, just a gentle patter at first, but with the promise of much worse to come. The 3 humans and 2 dogs gathered in Tempest's living room, surrounded by emergency supplies and the strange, suspended feeling that comes with waiting for disaster. "Tell me about Gale," Lucas said during a lull in conversation. Tempest looked up from the weather radio she'd been adjusting, surprise flickering across her face. "Why?" "Because I want to know about the person who shaped you. And because talking might help us all stay calm." Tempest glanced at Jazz, who nodded encouragingly. "She was my better half," Tempest said finally. "Smarter, kinder, more patient. She wanted to be a teacher, elementary school teacher. She would have been amazing at it." "What happened?" "Drunk driver. Middle of the afternoon, bright sunny day. She was coming home from a job interview at a school she really wanted to work for." Tempest's voice was steady, but Lucas could see the pain in her eyes. "I was supposed to meet her for dinner to celebrate, but I was chasing a storm system in North Georgia. I missed her call because I was too busy with my weather equipment." "That's not your fault," Lucas said gently, "isn't it? If I'd been there, maybe we would have gone somewhere else for dinner. Maybe she would have left 5 minutes later. Maybe nothing would have been different," Jazz interrupted. "Honey, you can't live your life in the maybes. Trust me, I've tried." Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and making the old building creak. Storm and the beagle pressed closer to their humans, seeking comfort. "What about you?" Tempest asked Lucas. "Tell me about Duke." Lucas was quiet for a moment, absently stroking Storm's ears. "Duke was a chocolate lab, 8 years old when Jennifer and I divorced. I'd had him since he was a puppy, before I even met her. But when she left..." He paused, remembering. "She said I loved that dog more than I loved her. She wasn't wrong." "Dogs are easier than people," Jazz observed. "They don't lie, they don't cheat, and they're always happy to see you come home." "Dogs also don't challenge you to grow," Tempest said softly. "They love you exactly as you are, which is wonderful but not always what you need." Lucas looked at her across the dimly lit room, struck by the insight. "Is that what Gale did for you? Challenge you to grow?" "Every day. She was the one who pushed me to go to graduate school, to start my blog, to take risks instead of always playing it safe." Tempest smiled sadly. "She would have loved this arrangement we have with Storm. She always said I needed something to force me to be responsible for someone other than myself. And now I'm sitting in a hurricane with a dog and 2 men who should have evacuated hours ago." She looked around the room at Jazz dozing in his chair, Storm curled up against Lucas's side, the beagle snoring softly on his blanket. I think she would have approved. By 10 p.m., the hurricane was announcing itself with authority. The wind howled like a living thing, driving rain against the windows in sheets. The power had gone out an hour earlier, leaving them with flashlights and the eerie red glow of emergency lighting. Storm was panting with anxiety, despite the calming music Lucas had found on a battery-powered radio. The beagle had crawled under Jazz's chair and refused to come out. Even Jazz himself seemed tense, though he tried to hide it with jokes about young people and their adventures. "I should pass over us in about 2 hours," Tempest reported, checking her weather instruments by flashlight. "Then we'll have maybe 30 minutes of calm before the back wall hits." A tremendous crack of thunder shook the building, followed by the sound of something large hitting the roof. "Tree branch," Jazz said calmly, though his knuckles were white where he gripped his chair arms. "Big tree branch," Tempest added, trying for levity. Another crash, this one accompanied by the tinkle of breaking glass somewhere in the building. "That was a window," Lucas said, standing up to investigate. "Leave it," Tempest said quickly. "It's probably upstairs, and we're safer staying down here together." She was right, but Lucas could see the effort it took her to stay calm and professional when her home was literally being torn apart around them. He moved to sit beside her on the couch, Storm immediately rearranging himself to lie across both their laps. "It's going to be okay," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to Tempest, Storm, or himself. "I know," she replied, but her voice was shaking slightly. The next 2 hours were the longest of Lucas's life. The hurricane raged outside with a fury that seemed personal, tearing at the carriage house with wind speeds that his mind couldn't quite process. Trees crashed down, windows shattered, and at one point something hit the building so hard that plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. Through it all, Tempest maintained her professional composure, tracking the storm's progress and providing updates like she was reporting from a comfortable studio instead of the middle of a disaster. But Lucas could feel the tension in her body where she pressed against his side, could see her hands shaking when she thought no one was looking. Just after midnight, the impossible happened. The wind stopped. The sudden silence was so complete that Lucas's ears rang. Outside, there was no howling, no crashing, no sound at all except the gentle patter of rain. "I," Tempest whispered, as if speaking too loudly might summon the storm back. They all moved to the windows, peering out at the devastation illuminated by Lucas's flashlight. Trees were down everywhere, debris scattered across what had been Jazz's neat garden, and Tempest's weather station on the roof was simply gone. But they were alive, battered and shaken, but alive. "How long do we have?" Jazz asked. 20, maybe 30 minutes before the back wall hits," Tempest replied. "It won't be as intense, but it'll still be bad." "Time enough," Jazz said mysteriously, and before anyone could ask what he meant, the old man was pulling on his rain jacket. "Jazz, no," Tempest said quickly. "You can't go outside." "Can and will. There's something I need to check on." He was out the door before anyone could stop him, the beagle whining anxiously at his departure. "Should we?" Lucas started. "Let him go," Tempest said, though she looked worried. "Jazz has survived more storms than both of us combined. He knows what he's doing." They spent the eye of the hurricane in strange, suspended calm. Storm finally relaxed enough to sleep, curled up between them on the couch. Lucas and Tempest sat in companionable silence, both too exhausted and emotionally drained for conversation. It was during these quiet minutes that Lucas realized something had shifted between them. Not back to the easy friendship they'd had before their night together, but forward to something deeper. Something that acknowledged the magnitude of what they'd just weathered together, not just the storm, but everything that had led them to this moment. "Tempest," he said quietly, not wanting to wake Storm or startle her. "I need to tell you something." She turned to look at him, her face pale and tired in the flashlight's glow. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I probably already have fallen in love with you, and I know that's complicated, and I know you said you wanted to keep things professional, but sitting here in the middle of a hurricane, I realize that life's too short and unpredictable to waste time pretending I don't feel what I feel." Tempest was quiet for so long that Lucas began to worry he'd made a terrible mistake. But then she reached over and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "And it terrifies me. Because of Gail? Because of everything. Because I don't know how to love someone without being afraid I'm going to lose them. Because you deserve better than someone who's still figuring out how to live with grief. Because this whole arrangement is crazy and we're probably going to mess it up." Probably, Lucas agreed, but maybe we mess it up together. Before Tempest could respond, the back wall of the hurricane announced its arrival with a roar that shook the building. The eye was over, and they had several more hours of storm to survive. But as Lucas held Tempest's hand and listened to Storm's peaceful breathing, he found himself thinking that some things were worth weathering any storm for. Jazz returned just as the worst of the back wall winds were dying down, soaked to the skin but grinning triumphantly. "Jazz!" Tempest exclaimed, jumping up to help him out of his wet jacket. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking," Jazz said, accepting a towel and settling back into his chair, "that some things can't wait for perfect weather." He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small, waterlogged box that he held out to Lucas. "What is this?" Lucas asked, accepting the box with confusion. "Engagement ring," Jazz said matter-of-factly. "Belonged to my wife, God rest her soul. Been sitting in my jewelry box for 15 years, waiting for the right moment." Lucas stared at the box, then at Jazz, then at Tempest, who was looking equally shocked. "Jazz, I can't." "Course you can't. Not yet, but you could. Someday, if you wanted to." Jazz's eyes twinkled. Seemed like something worth saving from the hurricane. Lucas looked at Tempest, who was staring at the ring box like it might explode. "Jazz," she said carefully, "we just admitted we're falling in love. We're nowhere near ready for—" "Who said anything about ready?" Jazz interrupted. "I wasn't ready when I married Eleanor. Nobody ever is. But sometimes life gives you something worth being unready for." Outside, the hurricane was finally moving away, its winds diminishing to merely tropical storm strength. Dawn was still hours away, but Lucas could sense the storm's departure in the way the building had stopped shaking, in the gradual return of normal sounds, dripping water, settling wood, the distant calls of emergency responders. They had survived. All of them. Lucas looked at the ring box in his hands, then at Tempest, then at Storm, who had woken up and was watching the proceedings with interest. "I'm not proposing," he said quickly. "Not tonight. Not yet." "Good," Tempest said, but she was smiling. "Because that would be crazy. Crazier than sharing custody of a dog with a stranger. Crazier than staying in a hurricane together. Crazier than falling in love during a natural disaster." They looked at each other across the storm-damaged room, surrounded by the debris of the night and the promise of whatever came next. "Maybe," Tempest said softly. "Crazy is exactly what we need." Chapter 5. After the Storm. The next morning, Charleston looked like a war zone. Lucas stood in what had been Jazz's front garden, surveying the damage in the harsh light of day. Ancient oaks that had weathered decades of storms lay across streets like fallen giants. Roofs were missing, windows were boarded up, and debris covered everything. Tree branches, pieces of siding, someone's patio furniture scattered 3 blocks from where it belonged. But the sun was shining. Birds were singing tentatively from the trees still standing, and Charleston's famous resilience was already evident in the sound of chainsaws and the sight of neighbors helping neighbors clear their property. "Could have been worse," Jazz said, joining him in the garden. The beagle trotted beside him, apparently none the worse for their hurricane adventure. "How can you tell?" Lucas asked, gesturing at the destruction around them. "Because we're all still here to complain about it," Jazz replied with the practical philosophy of someone who'd survived 8 decades of life's storms. "And because the roof's still on the carriage house, which means Tempest won't have to move out while she gets back on her feet." Lucas looked up at Tempest's building, which had indeed survived remarkably well despite missing several shutters and sporting what appeared to be a tree branch through one of the upper windows. She was up on the damaged roof deck now, trying to salvage what she could of her weather monitoring equipment, her hair pulled back in a messy bun and dirt smudged across her cheek. She looked beautiful and brave, and completely unaware that Lucas was watching her with the kind of expression that made Jazz chuckle knowingly. "You going to tell her?" the old man asked. "Tell her what?" that you're planning to stick around. Help her rebuild. Be part of whatever comes next. Lucas was quiet for a moment, watching Tempest wrestle with a piece of twisted metal that had once been an anemometer. I want to, he said finally, but I don't want to assume. Last night was intense. People say things during disasters that they don't necessarily mean in daylight. Son, Jazz said, settling onto his front porch steps despite the debris scattered around them. Let me tell you something about Tempest Cross. That girl doesn't say anything she doesn't mean, disaster or no disaster. When she told you she was falling in love with you, she wasn't talking about hurricane adrenaline. She was talking about the way you've been showing up for her every day for weeks, even when she was trying to keep you at arm's length. How do you know that? Because she talks about you. More than she realizes, and definitely more than she did about that beagle fellow from the dog park. Lucas felt something warm expand in his chest. She mentioned him to you? Mentioned him exactly once, in passing. But you're in half her conversations. Jazz grinned. Plus, I got eyes. Seen the way you two look at each other during those handoffs, like you're both trying not to want something you want very badly. Before Lucas could respond, Storm came bounding around the corner of the house, covered in mud, and carrying what appeared to be someone's welcome mat in his mouth. "Storm!" Tempest called from the roof. "Drop it!" Storm looked up at her, then at Lucas, then back at the mat. After a moment of consideration, he dropped his prize and trotted over to Lucas for attention, his tail wagging like nothing unusual had happened. "Good boy," Lucas said, scratching behind Storm's ears. "Did you find that in the neighbor's yard?" Storm barked once, which Lucas chose to interpret as confirmation. "I should probably go return this to whoever it belongs to," Lucas said to Jazz, picking up the muddy mat. "Probably should," Jazz agreed. "But first, you might want to help your girl down from that roof. She's not going to ask for help, but that ladder's not as steady as it was before the storm." Lucas looked up at Tempest, who was now trying to lower a partially destroyed weather vane to the ground by herself. The ladder she'd used to get onto the roof was indeed wobbling precariously. "Tempest!" he called up to her. "Let me help with that." "I've got it," she called back, just as the weather vane slipped from her grasp and crashed to the ground below. "Definitely got it," Lucas murmured, jogging over to steady the ladder. "Come on down. We can figure out the roof situation later." For a moment, he thought she might argue, but then she sighed and made her way carefully down the ladder, accepting his steadying hand when she reached the bottom. "Thanks," she said, and he noticed she didn't immediately step away from him. "How bad is it up there?" "Not as bad as it could have been. I lost most of my monitoring equipment, but the structure's sound. Jazz built things to last." She looked around at the debris-covered courtyard. "What about your house?" "I don't know yet. I came here first." "Lucas, you should check on your place. What if there's damage? What if—" "Then I'll deal with it," he said calmly. "But I wanted to make sure you were okay first." Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because you matter to me. Because what we talked about last night wasn't just hurricane emotions." He reached up to brush a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "Because I meant what I said about falling in love with you." Tempest leaned into his touch for just a moment before stepping back, her expression uncertain. "Lucas, we should talk. About last night. About what happens now. About whether you're planning to leave Charleston," he said quietly. She blinked. "What?" "You said you came here to escape memories. You said you were only staying through hurricane season. The hurricane's over, Tempest. So what happens now?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Around them, the sounds of post-storm cleanup continued, neighbors calling to each other, the distant whine of emergency vehicles, the steady rhythm of rebuilding beginning. "I don't know," Tempest said finally. "A week ago, I would have said I was leaving as soon as I could get my affairs in order. But now? She looked around at Jazz's damaged garden, at Storm playing with a stick he'd found in the debris, at the carriage house that had sheltered them through the worst of the storm. "Now I'm not sure I want to run anymore," she said quietly. "This place feels like home, in a way Atlanta never did, even before Gail died. And you?" She looked up at him with eyes that were vulnerable and hopeful and scared all at once. "You feel like something I've been looking for, without knowing I was looking." Lucas felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "So you'll stay?" "I'll stay. If you want me to stay." Instead of answering with words, Lucas kissed her. Right there in Jazz's hurricane-damaged garden, with Storm barking encouragement and the sound of chainsaws in the background, he kissed her like he'd been wanting to for weeks. She tasted like coffee and hope and new beginnings, and when she kissed him back with equal fervor, Lucas thought that maybe Jazz was right about some things being worth weathering any storm for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Storm was sitting at their feet with his tail wagging and what could only be described as a satisfied expression. "Well," came Jazz's voice from the porch, "it's about damn time." Later that afternoon, Lucas's house had fared better than expected. He'd lost several shutters, his fence was down, and there was a massive oak branch embedded in his back deck, but the structure was sound and the damage was mostly cosmetic. "Insurance will cover most of it," he told Tempest as they surveyed his backyard. "Could have been much worse." "Could have," she agreed, then paused. "Lucas, about what Jazz said last night. The ring." Lucas tensed. "What about it?" "I just want you to know that I'm not expecting... just because we said we're falling in love doesn't mean you need to feel pressured to..." "Tempest." She stopped talking and looked at him. "I'm not feeling pressured," he said gently. "If anything, I'm feeling the opposite. For the first time in 2 years, I'm feeling like the future might hold something worth planning for. But we barely know each other. We've been doing this arrangement for 5 weeks, and most of that time, we were trying not to get involved. So doesn't it seem crazy to be talking about forever when we're still figuring out right now?" Lucas considered this, watching Storm explore the debris in his backyard with the focused determination of a dog on a mission. "You know what I think is crazy," he said finally. "What?" "I think it's crazy that I spent 2 years after my divorce convinced I was better off alone. I think it's crazy that you drove all the way from Atlanta to Charleston to run away from your grief instead of dealing with it. I think it's crazy that we both happened to walk into that animal shelter on the same day and fall in love with the same dog. When you put it like that, when I put it like that, us falling in love seems like the least crazy thing that's happened." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not saying we need to get married tomorrow, Tempest. I'm saying I want to see where this goes. I want to build something with you, whatever that looks like. Even though I'm still figuring out how to live without my sister, even though I'm probably going to have bad days and emotional breakdowns and moments when I forget how to be happy, even though I'm a control freak who makes spreadsheets for everything, even though I work too much and probably need therapy to deal with my trust issues." They looked at each other across his disaster-struck backyard, both of them battered and tired and covered in debris, both of them offering themselves exactly as they were, flaws and all. "We're going to mess this up sometimes," Tempest said. "Probably," Lucas agreed. "We're going to fight about Storm's schedule, and whose turn it is to buy dog food and whether it's okay to let him sleep in the bed. Definitely. I'm going to want to chase storms, and you're going to worry about me, and we're going to have to figure out how to make that work." "We will." "How can you be so sure?" Lucas looked down at Storm, who had apparently given up his exploration and was now lying in the shade, watching his humans with the patient expression of a dog who knew they'd figure things out eventually. "Because we're good together," he said simply. "Because we both love that ridiculous dog enough to share custody with a stranger. Because you stayed with me in a hurricane, and I stayed with you. Because when I think about my future now, you're in it." Tempest was quiet for a long moment, studying his face like she was memorizing it. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay? Okay, let's try. Let's see where this goes. Let's build something together." Lucas's smile felt like sunrise after a long, dark storm. "Should we tell Storm?" he asked. As if he'd been waiting for permission, Storm jumped to his feet and trotted over to them, tail wagging enthusiastically. "I think he already knows," Tempest said, kneeling down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Don't you, buddy? You've been planning this all along." Storm barked once and pushed his head against her hand, then Lucas's, including them both in his circle of affection. "So what now?" Tempest asked, standing up and brushing dog hair off her jeans. "Now we start cleaning up the mess," Lucas said, gesturing at the debris around them, "and then we figure out the rest as we go." Together? Together. They spent the rest of the afternoon working side by side, clearing branches and debris, making lists of repairs needed, calling insurance companies and contractors. It was exhausting, mundane work, but Lucas found himself thinking that this was what love looked like in real life. Not grand gestures and perfect moments, but showing up for each other when things were messy and difficult and uncertain. As the sun began to set over hurricane-damaged Charleston, they sat on Lucas's front porch with Storm between them, sharing a takeout dinner from one of the few restaurants that had reopened. "So," Tempest said, twirling lo mein around her chopsticks, "co-parenting turned into actual parenting pretty quickly. Is that what we're calling this? Parenting? Well, we're sharing custody, sharing responsibilities, making decisions together about his welfare." She grinned. "Sounds like parenting to me." Lucas considered this. "In that case, I think we need to discuss our parenting philosophy. Are we going to be the permissive parents who let him sleep in the bed, or the strict parents who make him sleep in his own space?" "Depends. How big is your bed?" "King size." "Then we're definitely the permissive parents." Storm, apparently understanding that the conversation concerned him, wagged his tail approvingly. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the clearing sky, Lucas found himself thinking about cycles. How storms passed and seasons changed, how destruction led to rebuilding, how endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to let them. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a divorced veterinarian living alone in a house too big for one person, convinced that love was just another kind of risk he couldn't afford to take. Tonight, he was sitting on his porch with a woman who'd crashed into his carefully ordered life like a Category 3 hurricane, and a dog who'd somehow managed to bring them together despite their best efforts to keep things simple. Tomorrow, they'd wake up and keep rebuilding. His house, her equipment, their tentative new relationship. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments of doubt and uncertainty, disagreements about everything from Storm's feeding schedule to where they'd spend the holidays. But tonight, with Charleston's resilient spirit rising around them like the tide, Lucas allowed himself to believe that some storms were worth weathering, some risks were worth taking, and some kinds of love were strong enough to rebuild on. "Lucas?" Tempest's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yeah, thank you." "For what?" "For staying. For not evacuating. For choosing us." He reached over and took her hand, intertwining their fingers in the space between their chairs. "Thank you for letting me," he said simply. Storm, apparently deciding that his humans had done enough talking for one day, stood up and stretched, before settling himself across both their laps with the satisfied sigh of a dog whose plan had finally come together. And as Lucas sat there with Tempest's hand in his, and their dog draped across them like a living symbol of their improbable little family, he realized that sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. Epilogue. Clear skies. 6 months later, the beach at Folly Island sparkled in the late afternoon sun, waves lapping gently at the shore in the kind of perfect spring weather that made Charleston famous. Storm bounded through the surf, chasing seagulls with the eternal optimism of a dog who believed that this time, surely, he would catch one. "He never learns," Tempest said, laughing as Storm made another futile leap at a bird that was clearly toying with him. "Maybe that's the point," Lucas replied, adjusting the picnic blanket they'd spread on the sand. "Maybe the fun is in the chasing, not the catching." They'd made this trip to Folly Beach a Sunday tradition over the past few months, a chance to decompress from the week, let Storm run himself exhausted, and enjoy the simple pleasure of each other's company without the distractions of work and home repairs and the general chaos of building a life together. Because that's what they'd been doing, Lucas realized. Not just dating, not just figuring out their relationship, but actively building something permanent and real and worth protecting. Tempest's weather blog had exploded in popularity after her hurricane coverage, leading to a contract with the National Weather Service and a book deal for a memoir about storm chasing and healing. She'd moved her equipment into the restored carriage house permanently, turning the space into both home and professional headquarters. Lucas had opened his own veterinary practice, leaving the emergency clinic to focus on general care and the kind of long-term relationships with patients that had drawn him to veterinary medicine in the first place. His first client had been Jazz's aging beagle, followed quickly by every pet owner in a 3-block radius who'd heard about the vet who stayed for the hurricane. They'd officially moved in together 2 months ago, choosing Lucas's house for its bigger yard and Tempest's carriage house as her office. Storm had approved of the arrangement by immediately claiming the sunny spot by the French doors as his official napping location. "Lucas," Tempest said, pulling him from his thoughts. "Storm found something." Indeed, Storm had abandoned his seagull chase and was now digging enthusiastically in the sand about 20 yards down the beach, his tail wagging with the kind of excitement that usually meant trouble. "Should we investigate?" Lucas asked. "Probably." They walked over to find Storm had unearthed what appeared to be a piece of driftwood carved into an intricate shape, smooth and weathered by salt water, but clearly crafted by human hands. "It's beautiful," Tempest said, kneeling down to examine Storm's treasure. "Looks like it's been in the ocean for years." "Good find, boy," Lucas said, scratching behind Storm's ears. The dog beamed with pride, clearly pleased with his discovery. As Tempest turned the piece of driftwood over in her hands, Lucas felt his heart rate accelerate. This was it. The moment he'd been planning for weeks, waiting for the right time, the right place, the right alignment of courage and circumstance. "Tempest," he said, his voice not quite steady. She was still examining the driftwood, tracing its smooth curves with her fingers. "There's something else Storm found." "What do you mean?" Lucas knelt down in the sand beside her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Tempest's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "Lucas, before you say anything," he said quickly, "I want you to know that I'm not proposing because I think we should, or because it's been 6 months, or because Hurricane Helen made me realize life is short. I'm proposing because I love you, and because I want to spend the rest of my life building something beautiful with you." He opened the box, revealing the ring Jazz had given him that night during the storm, Eleanor's ring, cleaned and resized and sparkling in the late afternoon sun. "I love the way you chase storms and follow your passion even when it scares me," he continued. "I love the way you talk to Storm like he's a person, and the way you've adopted Jazz as your honorary grandfather. I love that you make me want to be braver, more spontaneous, more open to the beautiful chaos that comes with loving someone completely." Tempest was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked back and forth between the ring and his face. "I love that we're both still figuring out how to be happy after everything we've lost," Lucas said. "And I love that we're figuring it out together. So, Tempest Cross, will you marry me?" For a moment, the only sounds were the waves lapping at the shore and Storm's excited panting as he watched his humans with keen interest. Then Tempest launched herself at Lucas, knocking them both backward into the sand as she kissed him with all the passion and joy, and yes, that was in her heart. "Yes," she gasped between kisses. "Yes, yes, obviously yes, you ridiculous man." Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if Eleanor's ring had been waiting all these years for Tempest's hand. She held it up to catch the light, laughing through her tears. "It's perfect," she said. "Jazz is going to be insufferably smug about this." "He's already insufferably smug. He's been asking when I was going to make an honest woman of you for the past month." "And what did you tell him?" "That I was waiting for Storm to find the right piece of driftwood." Tempest looked down at the carved wood she'd dropped in the sand when Lucas proposed. "You planned this, the driftwood, bringing Storm to this exact spot." "I may have hidden it here yesterday during our scouting walk," Lucas admitted. "Storm's very good at finding things when he's supposed to." As if he understood that he was being praised, Storm barked and spun in a circle, spraying sand everywhere. "Come here, you brilliant boy," Tempest said, pulling Storm into their sandy embrace. "You did such a good job. Such a good job helping Daddy propose." "Daddy?" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Too weird. Not weird. Just accurate." Lucas scratched behind Storm's ears. "What do you think, Storm? Ready to make this official?" Storm's tail wagged so hard his entire back end wiggled, which they chose to interpret as enthusiastic approval. They sat on the beach until the sun set, making plans and sharing dreams and watching Storm chase ghost crabs in the fading light. They talked about wedding venues. Lucas voted for the Angel Oak, Tempest wanted the Battery, and guest lists, small, and whether Storm could be their ring bearer. Absolutely. "What would Gail think?" Tempest asked, as they packed up their picnic, the engagement ring catching starlight on her finger. "What do you think she'd think?" Tempest was quiet for a moment, considering. Over the past 6 months, her conversations with her sister's memory had evolved from desperate grief to gentle remembrance, from guilt-ridden monologues to the kind of imagined conversations that brought comfort instead of pain. "I think she'd say it's about time," Tempest said finally, "and that she approves of your spreadsheet-making tendencies because someone needs to keep me organized." She'd be right about that. "And I think she'd love Storm almost as much as we do." Almost. Well, she didn't have to share custody of him with a stubborn veterinarian for 6 weeks while pretending she wasn't falling in love. Lucas laughed, pulling her close as they walked back toward the car, Storm trotting contentedly beside them. "So what's next?" he asked. "Next we go home and call Jazz and Monica and probably your parents and definitely my mother, who's going to cry, and immediately start planning a wedding that's way too big and elaborate for what we actually want. After that? After that, we figure out the rest as we go. Together." "Together," Lucas agreed. As they loaded Storm into the back of Lucas's car, their car now, he supposed, Lucas caught sight of their reflection in the window. A woman with sand in her hair and joy on her face, a man who'd learned to love chaos as much as order, and a golden retriever who'd somehow managed to orchestrate the whole thing. They looked like a family. They looked like happiness. They looked like people who'd weathered the storms and found each other on the other side. "Ready to go home?" he asked Tempest as she buckled her seatbelt. She looked down at the engagement ring on her finger, then at Storm in the rearview mirror, then at Lucas, the man who'd agreed to share custody of a dog with a stranger and somehow ended up sharing his whole life. "Ready," she said, and meant it in every possible way. As they drove back toward Charleston, windows down and music playing softly, Storm's head hanging out the back window to catch the coastal breeze, Lucas found himself thinking that this was what happy endings looked like in real life. Not perfect, not without challenges ahead, but real and honest and built on the kind of love that could weather any storm, literal or metaphorical. The kind of love that started with a co-parenting pact and ended up being everything neither of them had known they were looking for. The kind of love that felt like coming home. The end. Author's note: Storm. Lucas Beauregard Cross lived happily ever after with his humans, eventually gaining 2 little sisters, human variety, and maintaining his position as the most spoiled dog in Charleston. Jazz Wise served as Storm's honorary grandfather and Lucas's best man at their wedding under the angel oak tree. Monica Sellers was maid of honor and cried through the entire ceremony. And yes, Storm was an excellent ring bearer, though he did try to chase a squirrel halfway through the vows. Tempest and Lucas still share custody of Storm. It's just that now they share everything else too.